Nice.
So good morning, very early good morning, depending on which part of the world you're joining us from today. This is the SAME Rhine-Main Post meeting. We'll be talking about construction schedule risk assessment update. So my name is Brian Osborne. I am the Rhine-Main Post president for this year. We are just three of us here in this room. We are actually speaking to you from the Amelia Earhart Center, Europe District headquarters here in Wiesbaden, Germany. With me is from the Post, Tim Conley, and from the Corps of Engineers, Dan Lowry, and he'll be speaking later on. Before we get to our presentation, I have some announcements I'd like to go through. If I can change the slides. Right. So first of all, I think everyone's probably used to these virtual meetings, but please keep your camera off and your microphone muted until the question and answer session at the end of the presentation. You can also put questions into the chat, and we'll make sure we pick those up. We will be recording the session and we post it to our website and the YouTube channel so that you can have a repeat. Or so people who aren't able to attend can also enjoy the presentation and the information presented. And we'll have the presentations will be on our website, which is, I think that's the wrong address actually.
We'll update it.
So we'll update this. For those who know SME, we updated our websites. They're now hosted on a different place. But if you go to the sme.org page, you will find our post, and there you'll find our video archive. These are the current serving post officers. If you have any questions about the activities of the post or would like to get involved, then please reach out to any of the post officers. The email contact is on our website, which is you can get to through the sme.org website. In particular, if you're interested in, so this is a message, if you're interested in volunteering for the post, either board member or there's my email address, you can contact me directly. We are getting towards the point where we'll be looking for, we'll be voting in the new board at the end of the year, at the beginning of January. We have a change of officers, so it's a good opportunity for anyone who would like to support to get involved. In particular, support with publicity, communications, website, admin, social media, etc. I think everybody in our business understands communication is probably the most important thing that we do, and we have, we no longer rely on email and websites. We have many other ways we like to communicate and reach out to people. So it's certainly a job where many hands make light work. Tim, would you like to talk about the programs?
Upcoming programs, I believe it's November 21st is going to be our resiliency presentation that we have. And we'll be going through a resiliency topic with the US government as well. And then please be on the lookout for our Christmas market event on the 12th of December. And then for our January event, and this one is typically very well visited by our members and people outside our community, and that's going to be on January 23rd at Clay Concern at the Little Italy facility. They're same as every year, but we expect a pretty big turnout for that. The Corps of Engineers will be presenting their FY25 program there. So be on the lookout. We'll be sending out invitations for that in the coming weeks. Brian, back to you.
Thanks, Tim. And we'll get those dates updated. We'll put this on the website. Actually, we had to move the November meeting to make way for Thanksgiving. That's that was the thing. So this is our current slide for our membership. We have, as opposed to 191 active members, we have 27 new members who joined the post in 2024, which is, we do like to see new members. And welcome to all of you, especially only on the call. We have a few members which are in what's called the grace period, which means you should be renewing your membership with SAME National, and we are looking forward to working closely with all our members as we move forward. On our sustaining members, and I think it's probably well known that SAME relies very heavily on sustaining members to fund the activities that we and our programs throughout the year. So we have 5 new companies that have joined in 2024. Welcome. Thank you very much for your support. And again, we have 3 companies which are in the grace period. So please reach out to your coordinator, whoever it is in your company, to make sure you get those subscriptions renewed. So these are the full range of sustaining members for the Right Mind Post. So we've had a very successful year in recruiting new members, and as I say, we really appreciate your support to do what we've managed to do. Just one note on the professionals and leadership development. It is one of our core activities is to assist with SAME's program to develop future leaders. So SAME has a leader development program. There's more information on their website, which is there. This is a program that runs annually. Application period is now open. There's a deadline to apply by the 1st of December. Again, if you look on the website, get some more information about what that involves. That will involve this starts off with the JETC conference in May next year, and then runs through to the next JETC conference. There's also some information there in terms of people looking for professional development credits and taking their professional engineering exam. Nick Irwin is our VP for Young Professionals and Leadership. So if you have any questions that aren't answered here on the website, please reach out to Nick. This is how we so this explains how we try and keep contact and keep information flowing out to our membership. Our website has recently been updated, so we have recordings of our past events. There's a lot of good information there, I think, especially for people that are new to the region. Some very good technical presentations and really real experts that were presented over the last years. Right, that's the end of the post announcements. I'll now hand over to Tim to introduce our speakers today. Thanks, Tim.
Thank you, Brian. So our October event today is going to focus on construction schedule risk assessment, otherwise known as CSRA. Big topic here at the Europe District and in Europe in general. We are delighted to have Patricia Bolton, who is the Regional Technical Specialist for Cost Engineering at the Corps of Engineers North Atlantic Division. We're also joined by Dan Lowry, who's the Chief of Cost Engineering at the Corps of Engineers Europe District. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Patricia. Patricia, if you'd like to start off our discussion, you may have some slides you want to share. Feel free to take over the presentation. Patricia, over to you.
Hi, good morning. Can we check?
Yes, we can hear you. Thanks.
Excellent. Give me a second here as I transition some things over. Bit early, and we've been running really hard on an awful lot of stuff in our program as we ended the fiscal year, and running full steam ahead into the next, and it's been a challenge for many. Let me switch to my camera. All right, now I should be sharing my screen in 2 seconds. We think. When you use the Teams on through the web browser, it's a little bit different experience. So pardon me for a second. Maybe I can get it into presentation mode. I will just go with this right now. Can you see it yet?
Not yet.
Not yet, Patty.
No, that's a bummer. 1 second here. Let me try to redo that. And if I can't, I'll just get into talking anyway. So hopefully I do intend to try to share that. Oh, now the button shows. Thank you. You should be able to see this now, correct?
Correct, we can see it. Thank you.
Oh, thanks. So I'd like to do is share the actual presentation. Hopefully I can do that for you. Now, do you see the presentation?
We can see we can see the program. I think it's good enough. It's not exactly presentation mode, but
Oh, so I'm seeing the wrong thing. So, okay, well then we'll
But
just put it.
it's fine. Yep.
All
I
right,
think
so
we'll
we'll
do
go back to here anyway. So, so great. Regardless, just welcome and thank you very much for inviting me to talk a little bit about really it's about Milcom programming and CSRA. And it's been a really challenging year, and I know that for many other individuals also with regards to completing these and the timelines that we have. But there's been an awful lot happening when it comes down to, frankly, and I thought I'd give you a little bit of a taste of what OSD, the Office of Secretary of the Defense, wants and what they put forth for us to do on the CSRA and their requirements. A little bit about the division, just to share with you. We're a pretty big division. Where I come from is at the MSC, headquartered at Fort Hamilton, New York, right next to the Verrazano Narrows Bridge. But we cover many different districts, including yourselves in Europe. So we're one of 9 major subordinate commands. We work throughout a very, very large area and with almost a quarter of the nation's population. Likewise, along with the amount of coastal regions that we cover and the employees that we have within ourselves. So just trying to show you the breadth of what we do and cover in NAD. And the fact is that our program this past year, most of our years we've done probably around, the $7 billion. This past year, we programmed and executed over 13 billion, which was almost, well, not quite, but definitely like 1.7 times the next largest division. So we've had a huge increase in delta in what we've programmed. Some of it has been due to some of our recent emergency responses and stuff like that, but it's just been a notable year. On to the CSRA. So much of this came in, we had in the past, and just to talk about that, Army Milcom design directives used to be focusing on a Code 3 parametric design. I think that's something that's affected many of us over time recently because it's been in our recent memory. That's exactly what has been the focus, is doing a parametric design, and that's what the budget has been focused on. Therefore, most of the costs and the design and what it was based on was a 15%, maybe, if that was even the case. And based on parametric analysis from using basically the PACS guidelines, which use a historical analysis generator, not anything significant, but there is an awful lot of, we work with the Navy many times on revisions to that, but it's only as accurate as the information that's presented within it. Why do I bring that up? Because that is the basis of what's behind the PAC system for the guidance unit costs. Beginning in 2013, the Army recognized, and basically also OSD, we started recognizing the Army, the fact that we needed to start doing Code 2s. So in doing Code 2 directives, getting that focus on a parametric design report, a PDR, with increased level of design, and I did a project at that same time frame, required us to do an awful lot upfront to get through what was originally done during the planning charrette, bring it to a design charrette and a 35%, and use that as the basis for the validation in the 3086. However, what they found still weren't getting at the 35%, and I think most of you are aware of that. What's happened since is that there's been the Lord memo. I'll give you some of the basic what came from this. And what came out of this was the requirements to increase the level of design maturity that's been provided, focusing on what we know has been an issue on the development of the scope. And why? The basis was to reduce the risk of underfunded projects. What they've noted is that they've had a significant number of projects that were underfunded, and managing the program became very significant. So Army took a look at it, started doing code 2s. Now we came down to the Department of Defense says, no, we got to take a look at this. We need to increase the fidelity of our budgets and that started with increasing the fidelity of the projects that were brought to the table and the basis of them. So we took a long time working with OSD, the tri-services, and talking about this very program and using CSRAs that we'd used in the Civil Works program and now bringing that to the Army. So we'll go a little bit further, and some of this supports a lot of the program and what we talk about for our requirements. So what's happened then is they did a financial management risk review. So they said, let's take a look at this, OSD. Let's define our risk management. They know that they've had an issue with awarding construction contracts for projects with the full scope determination. That had been a key critical issue. We know that there's been issues with the scope. And also awarding them with the total amount required. And allowing some flexibility between the projects for redistribution. So overall outcome that they're desiring is to reduce their financial risk management and the parameters for developing and refining those development primers for practicing the military. Pardon me. Get a really dry mouth. It's like 6:03. I've been up since 4. But the main focus is improving the budget estimate quality for the projects, therefore the program, and in order to reduce risk and to be able to execute the program. Very hard to execute, as we all know, as business persons, executing without having fidelity is very challenging. Taking a look at it, the first phase was to define those parameters and the practices that we needed to do and reform in order to be able to execute that. So now they said, let's take a look at updating our policy, the USD Lord memo, for the technical guidance for the submission and the requirements for the MILCOM projects for Congress authorization. I'm going to get a little bit technical here, so some I might fly through, but what I'm going to do right now is focus on here. We've gone from one level of project development to the next. Why? Because we need that fidelity. Phase 2 we are in right now is taking a look again at refining the budget process and refining a little bit more the risk analysis process. And I'll tell you why in a minute. I'm going to pause for 1 second and see if anyone has any questions to date. No problem? I don't see anything in the chat.
No, sounds good.
Okay, thank you. Go back to the slide deck. Oops. Now I realize I'm sharing what you guys see in yourselves also. Is this better? Can you see the slide deck again? Yes?
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Sorry. Need that. So then we take a look now saying, well, they got to do a little bit of an analysis as to what's happened. So, and I'll get into some of the background too for you. So now they're taking a look again at refining that to better integrate the CSRA output and be able to take a better look at the entire table. As you're aware, I think if people are aware of what the CSRA is at this point. And if not, I can go back to it for a little bit and just kind of give some background of what a CSRA is and what it looks like. But I'll leave that to Dan. But right now, taking a look at the full range of costs, and that would be from the 10% confidence level to the 90. We never talk, by the way, about the 0 and 100. There's no such thing. Even though I'll tell you, we acknowledge the fact that it is on the slides or on our requirements for the 6196. So we want to take a look at, consider the findings from our evaluation of the assessments and the range estimates. We want to resolve some of those key critical issues that we know that are in there and identify some of the gaps in the accounting. You'll see some of this, but we all focus on the AACE RP 41R, range estimating. That's the primary focus, and the one thing that we found just for fidelity and to take a look at why do we look at this? Because AACE is the leading group out there, and I'm a part of it, briefed there recently this past year, and that they have a very, very well developed process for risk estimating and focus on that technically every year and refining that program itself using the Monte Carlo. So it's a very useful technique, and many use it in many different areas and programs. So taking a look at it, what is the end game that's desired? In the end, we have right now the assessment requirements and deliverables with the OSD. And we're assessing those budget ranges. And we're also taking a look at the percent design completion, which is really important, along with the risk neutral estimate. What we really want to take a look at the entire range estimate probability function, what I was mentioning between the 10 and the 90. Because now they can manage the program with every project might vary in terms of the confidence level depending on their risk averse nature to each project and then also the program. If that makes sense to you. And then also taking a look at the cost neutral project itself, and then now looking at how we are at completion, the deliverable. So if we take a look at refining that process, they took a look at the FY24 specified MILCON projects under 20 million. We had 9 projects for Army, 32 Navy, 14 Air Force, and remaining 11. So we took a look at all of the estimate data that was developed. The maturity, so we took a look at what was estimated as the level of design maturity along with the class associated for the estimate that was provided. And then we took a little bit more look at some of the expected estimate variation that we really should have seen in the evaluation as opposed to what was found. That indicates our quality of CSRAs when we have that variance, not only the accuracy of the actual cost estimate, that focus estimate. And when they took a look at this, we found, well, looking at the 56R. So guys, this is the one big message to everybody, I believe. That 61R that we're forwarding up to Army, Navy, Air Force, and all others for OSD, we are collecting that data and taking a look at how good it is and what's been provided. So taking a look at all of them across the board and looking at the 6196, which includes this area here about when we have information that's not required or it's accepted and how well we actually filled in that form. So every little bit is being looked at. I think that's a big message. And this is a copy of what it would be in there. Now ours might be a little bit different from Navy and Air Force, but we come up with some of the same stuff. Okay. And when we did that, took a look and found out that our determination and ranges varied greatly. So some of them you can take a look over here on the right. You're generally okay in the green, right, but in the red or rose colored in red, a little bit too high of a variance. And that's what we're finding in these projects. So this is based on the entire range of estimates that were provided over all the projects and where we really stood. So as you can note, we got into some pretty high variances on some of these projects and areas rather quickly, and some of them we did really well. And so we had some key critical findings. Right now we have a pretty large disparity across, and this, by the way, FY24, remember, was our first year that we were doing this. And having reviewed the FY24s, all of them right now in the last few years, I can tell you that that year was a huge, the first 2 years definitely, and 3 were huge learning curves in doing this. The fidelity and background of what had been provided varied greatly. In general, what we had coming from developed by the core performed much better. And that's because we had many individuals, many more, just about, I'd say at least half by now. And I'm at this point more than all of our, at least half of our cost engineers. We're talking about over 200 people have experience with CSRA in the core right now. And that's going to probably become just about everybody within the next 2 years again. It's becoming definitely one of our core requirements as a cost engineer to be able to run these and do them. So what's kind of shocking out of these projects, only 7 were fully consistent with the level of maturity for the project deliverables. That's kind of really significant. So I don't, are we doing better? We are. We still have, from our estimation, a large gap. Now the data is being collected for 25 now, and we can provide some updates to that. I'd like to see, I think what we'll be able to do is then track things over every year to see hopefully some improvements. But this is pretty significant on number 2. Even though people reported that they had sufficient design maturity, they did not. Now, again, that was the first year, and we had an awful lot crammed in a short time frame, which is a big issue. So we know that we need to improve upon that, which is another thing. So we take a look again at some of our basis and taking a look at some of this. Now, I've shown this same slide in my other, but what we find is that this is a little bit wonky, but I'd like to make sure everyone understands that when we talk about an 80% confidence level, confidence interval, that's an interval. So that means you take away the 0 to 10 and then the 90 to 100, because we know that's very highly accurate to say that we know with full confidence that we know we have at 100% or 0, none, that level that we have sufficient funding or that number is within the right range. The tails, and it gets pretty narrow as we go up higher for our classification. But what we're missing is really what came down to is sufficient scope development. So what we want to do is narrow down and focus on getting to a better range, as in what's replied here. When we talk about level of design maturity for deliverables, that's a range. This is not a way to assess your project at all. You really have to take a look at each one of them and then make an overall estimate, an assumption about your design maturity and deliverables. And that's one thing that came out very clear too, is there needs to be much more integration at the very beginning of the project between the AE and USACE in developing the requirements for the design deliverable to meet to class 3. Super critical. Got to work together so that we know and we're all in agreement to what level of design and what areas are going to get to the class 3. Even though we say a 35% design, you can miss on key design elements that help to define the class of estimate. I'm going to stop there for a second for any questions.
Patty, it doesn't look like we have any questions online, but I thought I would just take the opportunity before we get too far down the line. On your key findings, you had mentioned that 7 of the projects fulfilled like the objective of what we're trying to do here. I'm paraphrasing. I know I'm not getting that exactly right. But if you were able to look at those 7 projects, is there one thing you can pull from that, or a key finding you can pull from that and say, this is what made the difference on those 7 projects?
The key finding, I think, would have, so 2 things. Number 1, on the 7 projects, the number 1 was so we're talking about design development. So this right here is the estimate classification is the first thing. And that classification, not there, biggest part was scope. And I think a lot of it had to do with all of a sudden, here you go, do this, right? With little preparation and probably not as much preparation or understanding about scope development and requirements for this for the AEs, so that it was very clear what you needed to do to be able to get to what we needed. It was kind of a hot mess, I believe. I think since then, it still continues to be scope. It's still, we are battling and always going back to number 1. And I think that's where the recent memorandum on requirements for MILCON project development so now installations are required to meet certain requirements in scope development for their initial budget submission, the original 1391 before we start this process. And that's about having your site, an acceptable site already. That's been a big one, right? Just having a site. So we're talking about basic scope, including size and requirements, other things, just even what power source you're going to have for the building, any number of things that are actually outrageously crazy that really impact our scope. There is a question now. I think someone's hand's up.
We do. We have a hand up. Please go ahead.
Yeah, just a quick question regarding this findings. How much you implement input from the garrisons on this portion due to different kind of, like over here in Europe, or best example in Germany where I'm right now, we have a lot of prioritization contracts with the utility providers. So sometimes we have to double check with them as well if they have a scope change after the fact, the scope is written to the core, or an ADP planning, or things which would be basic in the scope, but could change. And with those finding processes you describe right now, is this just figured out internal with core, or is this as well involving the garrison, which maybe have input which the core is not tracking from garrison to garrison? Because it's quite difficult, some things you discuss here and where you make decisions, and you don't see this from a single project what the background input is sometimes. So I'm just curious how much input you get for those findings for the garrison, or is this just taken care of for the core only? Because that could explain a lot of things as well on the other side.
No, a lot of this actually went over to AMCOM, who is over the garrisons. Whether or not the information gets down to the garrisons, I can't tell you, but it is a direct relationship and conversation between OSD, AMCOM, and
the Chief for
USACE.
AMCOM, pretty much with John.
Sorry?
So pretty much with John Germont, I guess. G4, Chief.
Yes.
Okay.
So they are intimately working.
Because the local decisions and contracts in such detail maybe has to discuss further down as well. Because the PMs of the Corps were actually on site for the projects. It would make sense if they coordinate this with the PMs of the project of the garrisons. And
Agreed.
Not only high, yeah. I was just curious because I'm pretty sure,
yes.
I think that's a pretty sure an item which can't be predictable for all parties and shows up different costs at the end, which is not really working as a team for a mission. I was just curious how much the garrisons are involved. That IMCOM is involved, I'm 100% tracking. The last 3 months, I was tracking that too, so I know how that conversation works. But the garrisons, I never seen, because I'm right now at the garrison level again. So
Mhm.
I've never seen an input that a PM of a project is implementing us in those findings. And I was curious if this is just a garrison issue from our garrison, or is it a general garrison question?
It's a very good point, and I think it goes back to stakeholder management, which is a topic in and of itself, which plays into identifying and developing the scope requirements. So very good point. Thank you very much.
No,
Okay.
and I appreciate it. No, you have a good one. I've actually took notes if you noticed, so I'm going to do a little bit of follow-up back up
Okay.
through USACE and to OSD and IMCOM and see if we can't push that button a little bit more. Make sense? Some
Okay.
of it came down from this memorandum that was requiring better scope determination up front in the original 1391. But I think that, like you're saying, that's not going to solve everything. And some of the issues that you're presenting are huge. Stakeholder management, one other thing we're finding from some of our DCEs is owner project requirements. That in itself is largely missing in everyone's repertoire.
Okay.
I see it very seldomly done well, and that initial effort is huge. So I don't
Yes.
know if many here are doing that.
No,
And
I
it's
think
not
there is
being,
yeah,
sorry?
there's missing a communication line right here, because the PMs and the DPW create the scope, then we send it out to the core as well. And if there's no feedback coming up that they have to do the finding here from the core, how can DPW implement additional information? Because the scope only describes one single project. But if it touches infrastructure, it's touching the installation itself. And it really depends, like when you do the finding search here to identify which finding it is, you need more than just the scope of the project. You need master planning, ADP planning input without
Right.
the scope of the project itself. So I was
So,
just curious if this ever get discussed on a different level, because in the KMC working group, on the stakeholder group, that's not a topic, because I'm in those meetings too.
uh-huh.
Okay.
No, and
Okay.
it's for me, it's a huge issue. I mean, you're not sidetracking us by any means. This goes back to many of what we find in doing a lot of our reviews for projects and everything. We go around everywhere, and it starts with, honestly, upfront. A lot more needs to be done at the planning charrette level. Just
Yes.
you can't fix it with a design charrette always. You really got to
No.
go back to that, and
Yes.
that's been a main beef I've had. I mean, I support you 100%. I'm trying to say that, and hearing it from you only supports my position more.
Yes.
So I appreciate that.
Yes. Okay.
Believe me,
Thanks.
it's annoying
Yes.
for everyone.
Both
I think it's
sides.
annoying,
It's
and
on
it
both
just,
sides.
yeah,
Yes.
no,
Both
and so
sides.
that's when we're driven by milestones. Let's just face this, and this is a good conversation to kind of segue into one other thing. When we are so driven by milestones in the Army, it really hurts us, right? But we're going to still be driven by milestones, just to say that. However, the milestones that have been reported and what we do we have a new general, and he is everyone, I'm sure you've already heard, is very much driven by data. And we know in the core we have some problems with some of our data in our management system. And that's because we're very heavily milestone driven, and we're going to make that milestone, darn it, no matter what. I see that changing. If we need to communicate it, we need to raise our hand a lot more as engineers, designers, and what have you. Work with PM a lot more upfront and clearly communicating our challenges in meeting certain milestones, requirements to execute that might impact it, and be very clear about that up front. We have to say that, not just say yes, sir, and then when we hit the milestone, miss it, then we're going to let them know. I think we need to be a lot better about that communication. Everyone, including myself and others in the past, or what have you, have been guilty of that, and that needs to change. Because I do see another thing that's a big message is that from him, improving engineering. So we got to, quote unquote, get the engineering right. Well, now we're challenged with defining what does that mean. And what I believe that means in this realm, and what we're talking here, in CSRA and cost, and what you'll find through some of these findings here, is a focus on getting that original cost estimate right. That's what we're talking about here on this slide, is getting that classification of cost estimate correct, but it's driven by the level of your design maturity of your deliverables. So we got to get that right up front. That means we got to talk about it when we're developing our task orders and knowing exactly what we've got to do and at least trying to tackle those things. Hopefully also with some of the original, absent doing better planning charrettes, hopefully through the initial design charrette, we can identify some of those things too. Let's go back to this area here. We're trying to narrow the band. So this is another slide here. We're talking about that same thing, that we should be narrowing the band as we go along, as the estimate class accuracy should also be increasing as well as the design development. So now we're talking about range estimates because we're saying the expected accuracy range within each estimate class, including the CSRA. And then if we go further forward, so one of the other focuses is looking at our systemic risks. So now we have to make sure when we're doing our CSRA, we are taking a look at some of those things. Now, CSRA, please, I understand and I know it's new to many, but we really do have to get at, I see a lot of the CSRAs that have some of this stuff. We need to also get at the technical risks. And that's one of the key findings I see when I see the CSRAs in the risk register. We're not really talking about the technical risks. So that's why the designer should really be there. And they have like assessed or assumed a certain amount of one of the big things is soil suitability, right? What did you assume? They assumed something in there. What was it? What could it be? What are your two different ranges and what is that basis? We don't talk about saying what percent. We don't ask that. We say, what did you assume for a soil depth? Well, what could it be? But knowing what their assumption was and why, then they should be able to tell you that they were already overly optimistic or not. The whole point is that we need to get at a good point estimate, not optimism on the design. We want them to actually have a point design, which gives us a point reference and a point cost estimate, and then informed by the variability on how much deeper, how much broader, how much difference in scope things can be. So that's a very fine point about developing CSRAs that's really critical. Take a look at all of our assessment data and taking a look at some of the systemic risks. But this is going to the same thing. We found that many were not really explicitly addressed. So some of them are including the skill level of the estimator. Now that's where I wanted to focus too, is one other thing. You're getting a good cost estimator. How do you know? We should be vetting not just our technical designers, but also our cost engineers. So if you're hiring or subcontracting or using other cost engineering firms, what are their qualifications? Because one thing that's been very clear, at least in the first few years that I was reviewing them, I got some CSRAs that were clearly overwritten by an individual who had no place in working with the program because they didn't even run the program, and I could tell. Now that's embarrassing, and I feel that that's a lack of QC, which has been a focus of mine in the division, is enforcing QC at every level. So before I get it, the district should have already QA'd what the AE should have QC'd. Does that make sense? And I find a lack of that. So I'm just trying to say, everyone, we got to get back to real. So when we talk about get the engineering right, that we're hearing from General Graham, we are hearing it loud and clear to the point where now he has, every month we're having week-long meetings, and they're program meetings for civil, military, and engineering included now. And that's a heavy focus. So, and I think that goes back to when we're we're really doing that initial task order, we're actually talking about reality and what it takes to do things and to do it right. Now, I'm not saying that we don't. I find that in some cases we really do a good job of that. I think we just need to highlight and advocate, dig through our files and our groups and our PDTs and use that key PDT to showcase everybody else, this is what we need to do better. We talked a little bit, and they did, about market and pricing conditions. Well, that was at the onset of a lot of other things going on with COVID and you name it. So we all focused on that really heavy. By the way, we shouldn't be, when we talk about these things, we should be very explicit and very descriptive. So we don't want to say big, broad terms, but these are systemic ones. But the other focus now has really been on the technical risk too, just to highlight. A little bit more analysis within each estimate class. I'm going to probably continue on further, but you'll see where some of them, and it's been across the board, have been high. We've seen a little bit more issues from some of the Air Force ones, a couple better here on the Army, and I think the SOCOM ones might look better only because SOCOM's a little bit more willing, and we all know probably for paying for more, better quality. But I think we're all up to that now. And we don't really do, and our assessment form doesn't really explicitly provide for consideration, but I think we've changed ours recently to actually talk in one area that we have on it, the systemic risk areas. And we found that they really have had no impact on the expected accuracy range within the estimate class. So that's the focus that I'm talking about, getting back to the technical risks. So I see, I believe, in various pockets, real acceptance of the value of doing the risk register and carrying it forward. That's something that we see with, we have something started in the Army with called quality risk indicators, and they're going to be reported on every project eventually. Right now we're starting off with ones over 20 million, but it's going to be every project now. And that's where we're going to start really talking about also some of these same things, and they're going to be reported. The suitability. So this, I'm going to pause for 2 seconds. We changed this based on this conversation here that we had a few months ago on this particular item. We changed a little bit about that and now continue to maintain the 5% after our CSRA. And the part of that is balancing this very issue that we've seen, because we used to put it within. Some of us who have done that said that no, our CSRA really includes that 5% contingency. I think from a very I don't know even how to say this. If you're trying to be very, from a philosophical perspective, yes, but that's not how it's actually been working out, if that makes sense. Partly because of how that 5% is programmed and how stakeholders feel that they own that 5%. So right now it's not included in it. We've seen it also with a variation in estimates. So conceptually, we've seen this. A good representation of the probabilistic cost range, but we had not seen that at the 50%. So technically 50%, if we're using that in our program, then our program should be pretty much within the range, given some are over and some are under. We found in general they were 5% underfunded, the program. So that means we're still off on them. And that's where this is showing some of that. We've been a little bit low and a little bit high on some of these others here, but largely we've been not really within our expected cost ranges. And that leads to another finding that we have here. They don't really give us a real expected accuracy range if we were really applying the 56R as required. So now we might still be understating our required contingency. And that was, like I mentioned, by about 5%. So now they're still taking a look at this and how we're going to close the gap in accounting for that. So that's where we count on you and the team to really develop a much better and articulate project risk register that actually has some meaning and usefulness for the PDT as you go forward. I find that right now, and that's been evident, that just about, most of them, it's a, please, the whole point is do not rubber stamp. I think that's the big message here. It is a focus. We do want the design and quality, and I think the other part of the message here is how much you can understand now that we are taking a look at it from our level and with OSD about what quality we're getting from these things, and they are getting a microscopic look. And what we're not doing now is going to impact further improvements to the program. Why? Because of OSD's desire to be able to manage the program much better. I think the main thing is don't worry about the output. The first thing is do a really good risk register that means something to the design team, to USACE, to the project management, and the stakeholders, because that becomes a really good tool for us to communicate what we're doing. This is a really good tool, especially when we take a look at that range of estimates, and then we can talk about our design maturity, right? And the numbers. So how we work as humans, we want to be able, okay, quantify it. What does it mean? This is a good way of quantifying those things, those known risks that we have, and even in some cases, some unknowns. Again, we want to close the gaps, take a look at some of the project, and that's what we want to really look at, project specific, not just your systemic, inherent risks or non-inherent. And some of the others that we found here. Of course, we know this, and it's going to improve over time. But what we find too, we're developing some of these, but they're not always addressed, mitigated, or eliminated. And that does not align, and that's the question that was asked here. It does not align with it. The intent is that we use the tool. I think I'm going a little bit further too deep in the weeds maybe, so I'm going to try to move a little bit further forward. This is all about construction cost engineering per the UFC and our requirements. And I think you'll see also not just cost, but design. We talked about owner's project requirements, charrettes, a much bigger focus on getting some of these early things done right. So when you need to, that's my thing. We need to talk a lot more about that and what's needed and what's required. A little bit better market analysis when we can. I know it's hard, particularly in your situation over there, but there are tools available for you. And I know I'll send a note of kudos to Dan Lowry. He has been, I trust him, I trust him an awful lot. Maybe, Dan, it's kudos to you that you do such a good job in taking a look at overall cost estimates, where they land, where they reside, and doing a really good analysis on performance. And that's truly necessary. So
Thanks,
good
Pat.
for you.
Would this be a good transition point to kind of get into some of the actual risk model discussion topics?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll let this go here then, because I don't really need to talk a little bit about these, but you can see some of the process and what needs to be done. I just wanted to say some final thoughts for you. We're often insufficient time for the CSRA. We got to really look at doing a good point estimate, not not a WAG, but that's that design maturity. And this is the thing, the baseline estimate used for should be account for only the known knowns. So that's what I was talking about. The design is a point design, without those variations, we need to get to the what it is, and then use the CSRA to be able to talk to our risks. That's all I got. And so transition, yes, to Dan. Dan, take it away. I think you've done, like I said, a great job. And that's one big thing, is understanding our data is very important. And appreciate the work you do. Over.
Thanks, Patty. Really appreciate that overview. I think that's very helpful in terms of understanding all of what's going on. My focus is going to be less on the kind of programmatic enterprise level stuff and more on really the kind of meat and potatoes of how these things work, some issues we're seeing currently, and some changes that are going to be going on with this Code 2 process, and specifically with the CSRAs. So I'll start by saying, beyond just the risk management aspect, the CSRA is important because it accounts for somewhere between typically 10 and 30% of your project cost. That's a lot of money tied up in this process, which is why it's important to get this right. As we've seen, there's been some growing pains to get through this over the last few years. One thing I'll say, and a big point of good news, is this last year, we closed out this process of risk analysis, estimate, the Code 2 completion. That whole thing was done on time and correctly. So Europe District, with the partnership of our AEs, installations, we were able to get these done on time. So that was a big milestone for everybody here. And I'm very grateful for everybody who has been involved in that process for helping to get those projects done on time. Some of my goals here are closer collaboration between the AE preparer and the USACE cost engineer and reviewer. Fewer review iterations. I know one thing that's probably frustrating for everybody involved is going through multiple iterations of reviews, when perhaps if we have a conversation up front, we can cut those down substantially and focus more on the high priority stuff once we get into that review process. And then just overall better products. I think the outcome of this is more accurate estimates, more accurate risk analyses. So kind of to meet those goals, we have updated the scopes of work for our cost and schedule risk analysis. If you're an AE who's going to be working on one of those and coming up in the next fiscal, this fiscal year, we're into FY25, you should be seeing that. So as you start work on this, I really encourage anybody who's doing it to take a close look at that appendix to your statement of work and review it and make sure you understand, the requirements that are there. Yeah, there's some substantial changes from where it used to be. The focus is on being more deterministic, clearly stating the requirements, so there's less uncertainty, which I'm hoping just makes this easier on both the AE and our reviewers here in Europe District. If there's questions, there's multiple paths to addressing those questions from the statement of work. Sometimes it's best to pursue that informally, make a phone call, send an email. Sometimes an RFI is best. Sometimes it's a combination of those two. But the overall intent is that if there's a question on what is required on a cost and schedule risk analysis, that we address that as early as possible so that we avoid any delays on the back end. Some things that I've seen that are going well. The workshops have been held, I believe, with all of the necessary participants. So that would include the AE design team, the risk analyst, USACE partners, and hopefully IMCOM as well, or somebody from the local DPW who can speak to those projects and other stakeholders. We've seen that some of the documentation that goes with these risk models is improving. And I've seen some more collaboration between the AE preparer and the USACE reviewer. Speaking with my folks here, there's a lot of phone calls happening, and there's greater collaboration once this process is started. I would like to move that collaboration towards the front end and start that process a little bit earlier. So when you're doing your kickoffs or design charrettes, that would be the best time to kind of start that collaborative process and make sure everybody is on the same page. I've had that same conversation with my folks here. They're aware that this is important, and they are also planning to start discussing the risk analysis process on projects where it is applicable to. So there are ongoing issues. This is a new process that is to be expected. Some of this is just quality control. So mismatch between the baseline estimate and the risk analysis, costs aren't lining up, things don't make sense. That's one of the items that for those who are preparing these, make sure that somebody looks at this, does a thorough review of your work in order to avoid just those kinds of simple numbers adding up kind of goals. Another thing we're seeing is a focus on the wrong portions of the project during the risk analysis process. So this risk analysis process is focused on construction cost and construction schedule. It's not focused on design cost and design schedule. So as you're looking at these risks, the focus needs to be on what is going to impact how long the project takes to build and how much that costs. What we've been seeing is a lot of design side risks. And I'll have some examples we'll go through, but issues where if a design change is made, that's going to extend the design period. Doesn't really have any impact on the construction cost, but it's still getting into the model, and it's the biggest problem it causes is it's taking away time from risk elements that need to be discussed in more detail. So avoid those design side risks unless they're going to have an impact on that construction schedule and construction cost. And then another issue has been modeling of very high risk impacts that should just be built into the baseline estimate. What I mean by that is if you have a risk that is almost certain to happen, you're at a 90% certainty this is going to occur, realistically, that just needs to be into the estimate. So that's not something that should be dealt in a risk model unless there's something very unusual about it. That's the kind of thing that should just be baked into the baseline. And then another item is just vague risks and a focus on just very general items. I think the goal here on some of these is to just kind of get some contingency into these projects. That said, this is dual purpose. Get the contingency in there where it's needed, but also to make this a useful risk management tool. And if the risks are too vague, then it's just not useful for that. So the focus needs to be on clear, concrete risks that can either be mitigated or tracked. And some areas to grow on is, I know everybody is doing these. They have your boilerplate kind of risk tables that you kind of go into each project with. That totally makes sense. There's a lot of risks that have overlap, but every project has its own unique risks as well. And once you're into that workshop where you're actually going over the risks with the PDT, with stakeholders, we need to get beyond those basic risks and start talking about project-specific items. What we want to avoid is just the same risk table on every project, because that's not realistic for those projects. Every project is unique, has its own unique problems, unique opportunities. And then we need to be careful about how we establish risk bounds. And I'll go through some examples that I think will make this clearer, but if you are saying a risk has a risk minimum cost of, let's say, $100,000, you're essentially saying that that project has a guaranteed cost impact of $100,000. That cost impact should be built into the baseline estimate. Your minimum risk cost or minimum schedule impact should be 0 or less. Otherwise, you're saying that impact is guaranteed. So we'll come back to an example on that, which I think will make clearer. And then I think the biggest area to grow on is a comprehensive modeling of these risks. What we're seeing a lot of is to develop impacts where we're saying, we have an extension of a utility line. What is happening is we're just saying, well, we're going to add 1% to the project cost to cover this impact. That's not what we need to be doing. What we need to be doing is saying, okay, how much additional utility impact, how much additional utility line are we going to need? What is that cost? And then building that into the risk model. We should be getting away from lump sums, percentages, those kinds of rule of thumb items. There are some cases where those are appropriate, but in general, we need to start modeling these risks as, what are their true impacts on the project cost estimate? These are all items that I've asked my folks to keep an eye on. They're items that have been kind of addressed in the most recent statement of work. If anybody has any questions on them at any time, you're welcome to call me or, talk to one of the cost engineers assigned to your project. They can also help you get where you want to be. Overall, for the future, where I would like us to be is more discussion, more communications, and to push that up to the front. So when you're having your kickoff meeting, your design charrette, make sure, you're talking with the cost engineer from USACE, the risk folks have a chance to talk with the right people and just get those conversations in up front. And we'll spend less time during the review process trying to make corrections. So what we're going to move into real quick is the actual CSRA worksheet. I'm going to zoom out for a second and I'll zoom back in, but this is the CSRA tool. It's a kind of a massive file. There's a lot going on with it. We're not going to look at the whole thing today. We're just going to look at the risk model. This is kind of the main meat of what goes into this. And this is where your risk analyst is going to be spending most of their time. So I've kind of dummied up four risks examples kind of as items to look at. The first one is an environmental compliance risk. And basically this is a local management agency may require additional design phase studies related to environmental protection measures. And the risk analyst has talked with the DPW and they found the range to be within $50,000 and $150,000 for study costs. And it could impact the design schedule by 2 to 6 months. The reason I put this on here is because this is a design phase risk. The risk does not impact the construction cost, and it's not really relevant to the construction contingency. Additionally, in the risk analysis workshop, the team felt this was a certain risk, which raises it to the level of why is this just not baked into the estimate itself. And in fact, if you're using the correct analysis tool, the most recent model, you'll see that the model is telling you to go back and relook at that basis of estimate and take another stab at it. So this is a very common issue that we've been seeing. I think it's an easy fix in the future, but going forward, be aware of it. The good side of this is that this was a good discussion at the workshop. The risk analysis and the team, they talked with the DPW, they got good cost information, and it should not be hard to go back and make adjustments. So the next risk is kind of what we were talking about before. This is an electrical utilities risk. The exact location of the tie-in point for electric power is not known. There's 3 possibilities: 200 meters away, 500 meters, and 1 kilometer. At this stage, it's just not possible to know what the right location is, but the team is assuming alternative 2 is kind of a middle ground option. And then during the workshop, the electrical engineer said it may increase the cost by $500,000 for option 1. Excuse me, cost may decrease by $500,000 if option 1 is the correct option, and cost may go up by $1 million for option 2. So the issue with this is it's a good discussion of the overall impacts. It's a good documentation of the risk itself, but the modeling was not done correctly. So in that workshop, the electrical engineer was asked for the cost amount, when in reality, what should have happened was, should have gone back to the cost estimate, set up a model to look at how much costs will increase depending on those options, and then use that to set up your cost impacts here, here, and here. That would be the proper way to do this. Additionally, go back and look at your schedule. What happens if we actually have this kind of change? So this is a big focus right now, is actually modeling these cost impacts and getting away from just sticking your finger in the air and coming up with a rule of thumb. So this is something that we're going to be looking for in the future. Example 3, I think we can finish this on time. This is a labor cost risk. So potential for a labor strike due to some sort of economic recession or another reason. In the discussion, the the workshop, they felt that based on a review of past labor strike lengths, maximum duration is 6 months, and that there's a field overhead impact rate of $50,000 per month, which is the upper limit for schedule cost impacts. So when we get into this, we're seeing, trying to make this a little clearer, but this column here is the cost impact. And what has happened is the preparer has set the project cost of 85 million times 5%. And they said that's the cost impact of this. And then just used a rule of thumb of 6 months to put it in there. And then come up with a schedule cost impact of $300,000 based on that $50,000 a month cost. Problem though, is there's no real basis for this number here. This is just a stuck-in number. There's no consideration of what is driving 5% of that cost, or even if it's applicable. And this has been kind of a reoccurring issue as well. We're seeing costs that are not supported, or not documented, and we need to get away from that and be very clear about the basis of what's being put in these risk models, especially for these high cost items. And then finally, move on to the last one. And this one is a general technical risk. The risk is future design changes or contract modifications may change the overall project's cost and schedule. Well, this is very true. That is something that has the very likely chance of happening, and it could have a significant impact. The risk itself is too vague to be useful. It's not useful from a management perspective. There's no way somebody can say, well, how do we mitigate this? What do we look for? It's just a general risk that adds cost and schedule to the project's contingency. Kind of additionally, the project does have a 5% contract modification contingency already, which accounts for some of this. So what is this risk actually capturing? And that's that documentation that needs to be included, discussed, and modeled. If we go over to the risk item itself, we can see that the risk model is based on a 2.5% lower bound for a cost decrease, the 5% upper bound for cost increase. So again, we're just looking at rules of thumb, percentages, and this is something we want to transition away from. So those are kind of the highlights of issues we've been seeing on the cost and schedule risk analysis. Those are the most significant factors that have been causing us within Europe district issues with getting these things approved. And there's items that we'll be looking for on future reviews. So as you're going forward with these projects, if you're an AE, highly recommend talking with the cost engineer from USACE assigned to your project, and they'll help you get into a better spot in terms of making sure everything is lined up the way it's supposed to be to get these things through the approval process. Gentlemen, that's all I have. So got a few minutes left and I'll.
Excellent. Thank you, Patricia. Thank you, Dan. Very thorough discussion on CSRA. I would open it up to the group before I have some questions, but I would open up to the group first if anybody would like to ask a question. Okay, I'm not seeing any hands going up or any questions in the chat. What I love about this discussion is that we have Patricia and we have Dan, and I was on the preparation calls for today's presentation and event, and we didn't spend a lot of time talking about like how are we going to join things up to make sure we have a unified message going out to the team on such a complicated topic as this. But from Patricia taking kind of a top-down enterprise level look and Dan taking a bottoms-up look, they mentioned a lot of very similar key messages, and I just wanted to point out some of those before we end the meeting. And that would be to quote Patricia, to get back to real. You use CSRA to get back to real. And what does that mean? It means proper QA/QC of the assumptions and thought that are going into the CSRA, and then to go back to Dan's point about having supported costs and not just taking random percentages and applying them to a cost, but actually getting risks out there that we can quantify. And then if the risk is 100%, then baking that risk into the cost estimate and again, that goes back to making it real. And then both speakers also talked a lot today about the importance of collaboration and communication. And again, to go back to Patricia's point, when she was mentioning her big messages was much more integration between the government and industry in developing the requirements and what are the requirements of a class 3. And also kind of coming out of this discussion, there's a really good inspirational message for us as a post for future events that we can maybe take into consideration, like scope of work development. I think that was something that you both touched on. And also to go back to the person who was asking the question before, the stakeholder management and the importance of managing the stakeholders, including the garrison, and getting their input, because as we said, when we're taking a look at scopes of work and real concrete items that can impact the project, so many times the knowledge of the locality and the site and all of that information is key to get in early. And again, as you were saying, Dan, increase the communication towards the beginning of the project so that we don't have so many fixes towards the end of the project, I think is going to be really important. And then maybe just to sum up as well, that CSRA isn't just about developing a contingency number for the project, but it's actually using and creating a tool that the PDT can use throughout the history of the project in order to manage the risks and to have a comprehensive view of the project as the project develops through the different design phases of the project. And so I just found it fascinating that we had so much commonality between Dan, you, and Patricia. So thank you very much for that. So many great messages coming out from today's event. And I just want to take this opportunity to thank Dan and thank Patricia. Both of you just so eloquent and intelligent how you speak on this topic. And I can say as an AE, it's a pleasure to work with both of you on these topics. And it's definitely a learning process, and we're making progress. And it's great to hear, Patricia, how you're taking a look at the what's coming out and looking at developing lessons learned on that so that we can be better in the future. Because that's really the goal of us as an organization and as a community, is really to improve the delivery of our design and construction infrastructure as we go forward. So thank you very much, both, for your time and effort in today's presentation. And with that, I'll turn it back to our president, Brian, for some closing remarks. Brian.
I think you've taken my closing remarks for me too.
Sorry, I stole your thunder. Sorry.
Excellent summary. I think it just need to thank everybody, first of all, everybody that joined the call and participated. But in particular to our speakers, Patricia, thank you very much once again. This is the third time you've spoken to the post on CSRA. The first one, I think, was February 22, where it was very new, lots of very sort of very practical information, but also the overview. And since then you came back, I think in I would say July 23, I'm guessing. And I think this presentation today, really some of the lessons learned and the analysis of how the CSRA is contributing and being factored into ODC. So it's really, really interesting. And Dan, thank you very much for your very practical and as Sim said, problems-solving approach. Really good. Thank you very much, both of you. And with that, I will close the meeting. Thank you very much, everybody, and see you all hopefully at our next presentation in November. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, everybody.